deference to Bob, because I know Bob's got a lot on his plate right now and stuff. We're gonna. Okay. And you take as much time as you need to get yours. Okay. Well, I've been asked to introduce myself for the video. So I'm Pete Goodell. I'm with the statewide UC statewide IPM program, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Sustainable Cotton Project. What did we learn in 2011? And I just want to mention that this is project was in partial support from California State Support Committee from Cotton Inc. So this of course is only to do with upland cotton, so we'll just ignore the rest of it. Wink, wink. And also I have to mention that this is the project agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board and US EPA on the Clean Water Act for Section 319. This is a supported project. So what did we do this last year? Well, first of all, we enrolled fields, and Luis is responsible for that, to find cotton growers who are willing to put a field into the program and let us get out there and work with you, improving IPM practices out there, among other things. And through this presentation, I'm going to call these focused cotton fields. So those are the fields that you had enrolled. And the fields are sampled on a weekly basis by Luis. So he takes accounts of pests and natural enemies and provides a weekly report. The focus fields, part of also what he collected was all of the plant mapping data, or the plant monitoring data, particularly with fruit retention. I mapped the focus fields and the crops surrounding those fields for 2 miles in a circle. So we knew exactly what was growing around you this last year. And then I want to review the lygus counts that Luis collected as it relates to those surrounding fields. So part of what I wanted to do with this little project was to see, could we begin to identify high-risk areas? If you put in a field today, or you actually said, this is what I'm going to plant, and you could figure out what's around you, could we sort of get a good prediction of what the risk was? My guess is we could all probably pretty well call that from our many years of experience. So why did we do it? Why did we do it? One of the things is I really want to increase the amount of information available for the Sustainable Pest Management Project. So both the plant monitoring, square retention, or additional pieces of information important in making good lygus decisions and working with your PCA and making those most economically important decision. And the presence and quantification of natural enemies. I want to understand the role of surrounding crops and the risk of lygus infestation, and really want to start stimulating some community discussion about just that landscape in which we all grow our cotton. And I'll start off with just this from 1967, Dr. Byrne Stir, basically reminding us that a grower faced with rising production costs at all levels must decide if he's going to rely completely on insecticides to fight lygus or find another method of control. But first we got to make, a major change must be made in farm practices to keep lygus out of cotton. And that's kind of the, this is nothing new. It's what we knew back in the 60s and even the 50s, all through the 70s. But getting that into reality of how do we manage lygus externally has been kind of a major part of my research program over the last few years. So basic to that is the source sink concept. You got to remember, in cotton, all the insects have got to move into the field. It's not like almonds that you have scale remaining, or navel orangeworm that overwinter in the mummies. Everything has to move back into the field, both good and bad. Cotton's not a preferred host, but if nothing else is close by, they'll settle in and they'll actually reproduce. But there are crops we all know that are very, very good hosts, and they'll build to high numbers. But most of the crops we have around us are moderate to poor hosts. And lygus will keep moving when a host disappears, either because you've harvested it, or you're getting ready to harvest it, or it's dried up. It will then move to find some place to reproduce. And cotton is in the landscape for a long period of time compared to a lot of other crops. Think about tomatoes or garlic. So it's one of the last crops that are out in the landscape when everything else is being harvested. So everything will have a tendency, if it's around, to move in. So everything's got to move in, and how much moves in depends on what's around you. Well, this is just some work we did some years ago showing 4 different areas in the San Joaquin Valley, with just showing the different cropping patterns we have by those color mosaics. But you're going to notice on those color mosaics as well that the size of the squares are different. And so if you go off to the west side, you're getting into this larger quarter section size, and the fireball area is probably more reminiscent of what Chowchilla is, with smaller acreage, transect with riparian areas and otter-shaped irregular fields. But nonetheless, you can see that there's a very big mix of crops in any particular area. So what are the major sources and sinks? Well, probably all do this. Sources, safflower can be a source from a mile away. Seed alfalfa can be a source from 2 miles away. Alfalfa hay can be a source, and sugar beets can be a source. Now this data is based upon our 3 years of our large-scale multi-state ramp project we had, where we looked at over 60, 70 fields over 3 years and looked at what the population of lygus was compared to what's around there, and found that, you know, as expected, these are common sources, and a sink, that is a place where the lygus will come into and not tend to leave, tend to be alfalfa hay, cotton, and tomato. Now, didn't you just tell me that alfalfa hay was a source? It is. It's a source and it's a sink possibility, depending upon how it's managed. And that's one of the complexities of dealing with our landscape. But if you see here, this isn't a list of hundreds of crops. These are the ones that we're pretty familiar with in terms of what might be the source. We know that alfalfa is a key crop. It's not a preferred host. It's a preferred host, excuse me, but it's not susceptible to the damage, so it's not being treated for lygus. So it's a great place for our resistance management programs because it isn't being sprayed on a regular basis with a lot of the same products. I think key to alfalfa is that it's one of the few crops we grow for the vegetative rather than the reproductive parts. So it's growing vegetatively and we cut it. It grows vegetatively, we cut it. So as far as the insect's concerned, one day it's fine, the next day I'm in a windrow getting cooked, wondering what the heck just happened to me. Nowhere was there any stress coming from that plant telling me it's time to move on. So lygus does not really want to leave an alfalfa field unless it absolutely has to. The crop, as I say, is always in a vigorous reproductive state, and it really is plays an important role of absorbing lygus from a surrounding area, and can take a lot of lygus from a surrounding area. It's good. In other words, it's a very, very good sink. But if you have 160 acres of alfalfa and you cut it, and there's no other alfalfa around, they will leave the alfalfa field, and they will tend to move out, but they'll also tend not to want to stay. They want to move back into the alfalfa. So, just some studies we did some years ago using Kern County on a large-scale cropping basis, we found that where you had a good ratio, that would be these guys, of cotton to alfalfa, that is to say there's a good ratio of cotton to alfalfa, our pesticide use was lower in those areas. Where it was almost all cotton, the pesticide use for June and July, so that would be primarily for lygus, was higher. So, oops, excuse me. So we know that where we do have a mix, and somebody was mentioning this, I think it was Chad, you were talking earlier about how you have enough alfalfa where you're cutting blocks practically every week. So you're already creating this mosaic of cut alfalfa, uncut alfalfa, so the bugs can move between these particular fields. And that's where we found that there's far fewer lygus problems. And I think up where you are, up by the Y and beyond, it's much different than being on the west side out by the Lemoore Naval Air Base. And safflower we know is an important source because primarily it's a great host. Lygus love it and they build on it, but it provides a critical early habitat, that habitat between overwintering and summer. It builds up in those things, just like it does in a lot of the weedy areas in high lygus years. So it's really critical in building up lygus. The crop dries and they move right off into cotton, a very sensitive part. That's why it's such an important part of the cotton lygus IPM story. So the question is how much risk does a particular sink pose? Well, it depends on what the strength of that source is. Is it a really good host that builds lygus to high numbers? And how far away is that source from your field? And how is that source managed? And those are kind of logical things we can think about. If you're next door to an unmanaged safflower field, you know you got a problem. And you're probably going to have to start figuring out how to budget for that problem. On the other hand, if it's a couple miles away, maybe it's not. Or maybe it's next to you, but it's being managed. So how big a risk depends on what sort of a source it is, how far it is, and how it's being managed. Okay, so getting to this year. This is the Lygus Community Mapping Project we've been doing for a number of years now. This is web-based. It's publicly accessible. You can look at this right now today if you wanted to and see the same map. I would love to have people actually take their farm maps and populate this particular map for us. I basically drove around hours and hours up and down roads trying to get all these fields mapped. I would like to find a way that we, particularly perhaps as you're being enrolled next year in this, I can bring Luis, either put it on Luis's computer or sit with Luis, and we can basically populate your farm on this map, and then you can go ahead and use that as one of your farm maps right off the bat. This is the part that Cotton Incorporated has provided us with support with the GIS office there at the Kearney Ag Center. So let's just move into this area here so you can see, basically what you do is just move your mouse over, you click on this, and you say, and this field here, there's a list of crops that drop down, you click on the crop that it is, maybe put in some information you have on it, and boom, that's populated. And so this will be erased next year, and we'll start filling it up again. This map allows you, of course, it uses the Google-based mapping services, so you can overlay a high-quality photograph. And if you want to get in real close, that's how close you can get in.
Is that where we actually are?
That's actually where you are. That's just the building. It just so I just kept. You can see that's down about as close as I get. But yeah, that's the clarity of it. If nothing else, it's fun to play
Our
with.
cars aren't there. We're there.
Huh?
Our cars aren't there.
Yeah, there's
We're
nobody
there.
parked there.
Well, you know, I haven't called CIA to get us the next satellite pass. Okay. So here's the data that Luis collected this year on the sustainable cotton fields, and I'm going to spend the rest of the talk on each individual line through this. And I'm kidding. I'm kidding. What do you make with that? I mean, that's the problem, is what do you make of that kind of data? Well, what I did with it is I kept this scale of 14 per 50 sweeps, and I broke it down by what I considered low, moderate, and high populations. So there's the low populations, and they're the fields that have the low populations. It never really went over 4. Here's some low to moderate. It went to 4, but it kind of stayed at 4 to 5. There's a moderate population, it went over 6, and then of course the high population that went over all the way up to 12 and beyond. And you can
net or adults?
Huh?
Are these net
This
or
total.
adults? Oh,
It's total. Thank you.
Well, that's not our farm number then up there.
It
It is.
should be your farm number. Up there.
Oh, okay, it should be our farm number.
It should be your farm number up there, as best as I can. Yeah. So you can see that probably there were applications being placed in here, dropping that population down and population coming back up. So where we had high populations, it looks like we also had continued pressure there. So my question was, is there anything unique about where low populations were, fields were found with low populations as opposed to high populations in terms of that surrounding area? So using GIS magic, we basically took the focus field, which is here in blue, and we went half a mile, and 2 miles out, and basically cut donut holes out of here and analyzed what crops were there at what distances. A half mile, mile, and 2 miles. And I went 2 miles because that's about the limit of what we sort of see a relationship between what a source is and this particular field. This is what the crop frequency around those 17 cotton fields look like. So you can see that this is ring 1, half mile, ring 2 is a mile, and ring 3 is 2 miles. And you can see that cotton was the most common crop in all 3 rings. That's actually pretty good news, since cotton acts as a sink. It doesn't produce lygus, it absorbs it. And if you're surrounded by cotton, it's got to go through all that cotton around you before it gets to your field. Tomato was very common, grain, alfalfa, almonds. You can see that the crops that you'd expect to see were the common crops through there. And then it quickly kind of tends to drop off, as you can see. This is the number of occurrences in a particular ring. Okay, so these are the data Luis reported to me with the average of the 3 rings. Now you're going to see 3 cropping systems, or 3 crops here. That isn't the 3 rings in this case. That is what was the most common crop in all 3 rings at this particular location. So what I've done is taken 5 locations and narrowed it down to that. And B31 wasn't in our sustainable cotton program, but it's Bowles Ranches, and they provided me with some data. So their peak density, we go from about 4.5 up to 10 for these 5 fields we're looking at. When did that peak density occur? Late in the season for these guys, and mid-season for those guys. These were, let me take it down to the next one. These are the number of applications that went onto those fields. This treatment wasn't put in August to treat this. It was put in June to treat about a 4 count at that particular time. So this doesn't relate to these dates, but it just tells you that the peak occurred late in the season here, but only one application was put on, and that was done early to protect early squares and not knowing what the rest of the year was going to look like after the terrible beginning. And that's what the three surrounding crops look like. In both cases, we're surrounded by largely, and by that I mean those three crops there represent about 60% of all the land area in the 2 miles surrounding that cotton field. So cotton, alfalfa, tomatoes end up as high crops in both places where you had lower populations. Cotton, fresh corn, and safflower comes up on the kind of the intermediate one, and then are the high ones, almonds, tomatoes, and melons, and uncultivated cotton and safflower. Now this is interesting because these almonds and melons didn't come up in any of the lists. So why are they common and still have a high population?
They have nowhere else to go.
Well, that's part of it, I think. I think it's basically, well, the melons obviously, remember it's July 29th, the melons may have already begun to come out of production. The uncultivated in this case might have been retirement lands, but it was also a lot of grain off in that area that was planted, rain-fed grain off in some of that retired land of the Westlands Water District that was already harvested well before any of the cotton was even susceptible. So essentially it's bare ground. But it was also located across the street from safflower, and I think we see that as a major. This is George Betancourt's field here, where we had our meeting. And there was a lot of fresh corn next to it, and of course that safflower field almost a mile long next to it. But that was managed with George to limit the amount of lygus that was going to be coming in. And so 3 applications under that kind of pressure I thought was fairly good. And his peak numbers didn't really get all that high across this is average for the entire field, of course.
Just as a note, the safflower was also treated 3 times.
So on top of the
cotton.
Yeah, the cotton, yeah, it was beat back as well. And,
wow.
and
We're getting 60 counts out of the safflower.
so you can see that a cotton alfalfa, the things we kind of already knew, I already kind of had a hunch that this is a nice combination to have, actually does. And then beyond that, it kind of depends on not only what your crops are, but I think also what's not there. So if there's a lot of uncultivated land, or, you know, years and years ago, somebody once asked me, how far will a lygus fly? My response was, as far as it can, or as far as it has to. I know that sounds flippant, but in fact it's true, that if it can get to a cotton field in a half a mile, that's good. But if it takes 3 miles to get to it and it has the strength, it'll probably keep moving until it finds something. I know talking to J.G. Boswell last couple of years, they felt like during 2008 when all that safflower was scattered around, they felt like they were getting 5 miles. And that kind of makes sense. If you have a big patch of safflower with a huge population, some of those guys are going to be able to make some distance if there's nothing else between you and the cotton. So a couple of things that I try to remind myself as I'm trying to get a better handle on this. It's a very complex situation. It's not easy to say, if I look at a map, I can tell you whether it's going to be a big problem or a bad problem. A big problem or not a problem. Again, you've got to know what your strength of your source is. How good a host is it? I think we know that one pretty well. The distance, well, we get a good idea of that. 1 to 2 miles is kind of the threatening distance from a cotton field. It's the number of fields that can act as an alternative host between you and that source. So if you've got lots of cotton between you and that source, it kind of is your neighbor's problem at that point. And they probably will treat it. So it takes care of that threat to you. What happens if you happen to have a lot of alfalfa in between you? It's probably going to be absorbed. You're never going to see it. And then it's the management employed on those source fields. If you treated the safflower and you manage the alfalfa with strips, those major sources don't become sources anymore. So that's what working with a statistician on the RAMP project with all these fields, he just couldn't get it. He says, but sometimes we find safflower is actually a sink. They're drawing it away. I'm going, well, that's only because you don't know if it was treated or not. If you leave it alone, I can tell you what it's going to do. What I can't tell you is how it's going to be managed. And that probably is just going strictly neighbor to neighbor, saying, look, we got to do something. If I got to pay for the sprays, I'll do it, or whatever. So it's really kind of in some ways it's pretty straightforward. And in other ways it's very complicated depending upon what's between you and that source, and how many sources there are, and how those sources are being managed. But I really think we're getting you know, a project like this couldn't occur except in this kind of an environment. And having someone like Luis out there taking samples, and then being able to look at them from another standpoint. Kern County maps everything when you do your pesticide permitting. You can get a crop map of Kern County in July. So I start calling PCAs down there saying, can you send me your lygus information? And I'm shocked to find out they don't keep it. You know, they report, and then, you know, one guy does. And so tomorrow I'm going down to work with him to pull out 5 fields that were a real problem, not a problem, and was a surprise. And then we're going to do the same kind of analysis because we've got all the GIS data. So we're getting a little bit better handle, I think, on just what sorts of interactions there are. And bear in mind that this one PCA that down there at Button Willow area, I think he sprayed every week for lygus for 6 or 7 weeks.
Wow.
It all came out of a reserve area that they're watering and using as and it just releases on them all the time. He says, yeah, he doesn't even start setting squares till almost four weeks in. That's one of Tony's fields. So plans for 2012, pretty much the same. I'd like to get people a little bit more involved if you want to be in some of the community mapping. If not, certainly check the website out every time you want to see just what sort of crops are coming up in the area. We talked a little bit about more field discussions. I'd like to integrate the natural enemy data into more decision making, if we could. I'd like to evaluate some of those vegetative strips, some of the habitat strips we planted around cotton, just to see if we're getting some benefit into the field, and continue to increase our understanding of our community landscape. And again, this kind of study is extremely unique. I'm heading back to Europe in May, where they have a functional biodiversity workshop every 3 years. And Europe is completely different than California, to be sure, but nothing like this I've seen in the literature has had this opportunity that can exist with a community like we have here. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate everybody's patience and willingness to let us wander around your fields and try and look at things. So I appreciate it. And Bob, took longer than I thought, and I apologize if. Okay.
Pete, is there any advantage of spraying lygus and safflower
Any?
earlier stage, I mean, before they take off?
Yeah, that's the key.
Nymph.
You catch them in between the generation.
Keep it down.
That's why it's 600 degree days after April 1st is what the magic figure is. Because by that time you should have everything hatched out,
Okay.
but no reproduction yet and no wings. That's the idea, is you beat them down and make them disappear.
Fly.
Right.
Okay.
That's the point of the safflower management program.
That's what I.
And what's happened as more safflowers come in, and we've learned again about this, is the people down in down around Lemoore in that area where there's a lot of safflower, they generally are saying about 3 applications is what it's taking.
Is safflower market price right now is like $5.40 FOB. So there might be more safflower this year.
Nice. Yeah, particularly since the reason why in 2008 it was not only the price, but it was also the water issue.
Right.
You know, if you pre-irrigated for cotton, you could put safflower in.
Yeah.
So. Other questions,
Wow.
Bob?
Where's that picture?
Yeah.
How big of a host is almonds for lygus?
We can't find that it is, but you may remember Galen Hyatt, who worked 50 years out there on the west side. He kept saying some of his cotton fields next to the almonds are always getting attacked.
Mm-hmm.
I've come to the conclusion that it may be the lygus are flying in to get the shade into the almonds, moving through the field, and the next thing out there's cotton, and they're moving from there to where they're really going to a somewhat more preferred host than the almonds.
I thought it was something like a leaf-footed plant bug. You just can't find them out there. They're hard to find.
Yeah. But I
they're
know,
there.
yeah. I've looked, but you're right. It's like the leaf-footed. But it's prior to this point, prior to the leaf-foot and the stink bug, you really haven't had that much problem with the nuts and plant bugs. So lygus have been there, but not causing that much of a particularly once you realize once those shells begin to harden off even a little bit, it can't get through it.
I didn't think that the lygus is an issue in the almonds, but the almonds are a host for the lygus, and they move into the cotton.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a great host. I don't think it's a great host. I don't even know if it's a reproductive host. I think what it is it acts as a place where they can find shelter, maybe get some moisture, and then just kind of end up filtering through. I've a couple of places I've watched. That's kind of my theory as to what's going on with it, but I don't have any proof.
So, a lygus flying over alfalfa, flying over cotton, is it attracted to the humidity, the green?
I think it's the humidity. I think you're right on with the humidity.
And
I
so
think-
later, cotton is pretty humid.
or if you cut your alfalfa while you're irrigating your cotton.
They're gonna.
And the reason why I say that too, John, I appreciate that, is we had some trials at Shafter where we put in alfalfa strips as a management technique for the station. And one experiment next to that alfalfa strip was an irrigation, and the plot that was right next to the alfalfa was an over-irrigated plot. And those suckers couldn't tell the difference between the two. And that's what I've always thought too, and I think that's also why we see them coming out of creek beds. You know, as the hills dry down, they go
Yeah.
down there and then they kind of follow the creeks down. You know, that's always been my theory. Again, the only way you could ever prove that, and they've got techniques to do it now, and Jay Rose and I had a student who just finished, she's writing it up right now, where she sprayed alfalfa fields with egg white. Or she did it with soy milk. So you put a protein on that bug,
Oh, you can trace that.
and then you cut it and let them go out, then you sample, then you take those bugs and you squash them and you try and find out if you got that protein on it. So you could theoretically do it to the west side and watch this, or coming into a, spraying something next to an almond field, then follow it into the cotton field. The problem with that is it's a very low probability of getting those bugs back, very low return.
Yes.
I think she invented a branch of math to just figure out how to deal with those numbers, but we do have the technology now. And they're doing it with pollinators now. They're doing it big time in apples up in the northwest, where they'll actually spray them with different kinds of proteins and then look at the beneficial insects in an orchard to see where they originated from. It's really kind of cool. Where everybody else kind of goes out in the country and kind of takes a little spray bottle, she goes out and hires a helicopter to, and they're just looking at this going, "You're kidding me." Well, we got to do it that way. When you're working with Boswell, it's 1 square mile is a field. So
Yeah.
anyway, Bob, you gonna take it from here?